The silence in the Caldwell residence was a carefully curated masterpiece. It was a silence woven from the finest threads of wealth, a quiet that spoke of thick carpets, solid oak doors, and sprawling rooms that kept secrets as well as they kept the chill of the evening at bay. Eleanor Caldwell, mistress of this silent domain, sat in a wing-back chair upholstered in dove-grey velvet, the book in her lap unread for the better part of an hour. Her gaze was fixed on the grand Palladian window, watching the last vestiges of a bruised purple sunset surrender to the encroaching night. For 15 years, this house had been their world. For 15 years, Marcus had been her world. He was the brilliant, charismatic attorney, the man whose laughter once filled these cavernous rooms, whose touch could make her forget the immense, sometimes burdensome, weight of her family's legacy. She had been the heiress, the quiet power behind his public success, the one who had provided the capital for him to become a partner at his prestigious law firm, the one who had bought this very house as a wedding gift to them both. It had been a partnership, she'd always believed, a union of his ambition and her resources, bound by what she thought was an unshakable love. But lately, the silence had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, laden with unspoken words and a tension that coiled in the air like a serpent. Marcus had become a ghost in his own home. The late nights at the office, once a rarity, were now the norm. His phone, once left carelessly on the kitchen counter, was now perpetually in his pocket, screen down, guarded like a state secret. When he looked at her, his eyes, once so full of warmth, seemed to skim over her surface, seeing not his wife, but an obstacle, a piece of familiar furniture. Tonight was their 15th anniversary. She had made reservations at Per Se, his favorite, months in advance. She wore the sapphire dress he'd bought her in Paris 5 years ago, a time when he still looked at her as if she were the only woman in the world. A single perfect diamond rested in the hollow of her throat, a gift from their 10th anniversary. She was a portrait of a cherished wife, waiting for her husband. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 9, each sonorous bell a small death knell to her hopes. At 9:30, a text message finally illuminated her phone. "So sorry, darling. Swamped with the Henderson merger. Can't break away. Rain check? M." Darling, the word was a hollow echo of affection, a mechanical platitude. She didn't reply. She simply stared at the message, a cold, hard knot forming in her stomach. The Henderson merger had closed last week. She knew this because her own investment firm had a minor stake in it. The lie was so blatant, so lazy, it was more insulting than the truth would have been. She stood up, the silk of her dress rustling in the oppressive quiet. Walking over to the liquor cabinet, a behemoth of polished mahogany, she poured herself a small measure of Macallan 25. The amber liquid burned a welcome path down her throat. It was in that moment, the sting of the scotch mingling with the ache in her chest, that a quiet resolve began to crystallize within her. For years, she had been the supportive, trusting wife. She had ignored the small inconsistencies, the faint floral scent on his suit jacket that wasn't her perfume, the sudden need for privacy from a man who had once shared everything. She had chalked it up to stress, to the pressures of his career. She had been a fool. The trust, once the bedrock of their marriage, had eroded so slowly she hadn't noticed until she was standing on the edge of a chasm. Now, looking down into that abyss, she felt not fear, but a chilling clarity. She would no longer wait in silent dignity. She would find out the truth. She would follow this thread of deceit, no matter where it led, no matter how much it unraveled the life she had so carefully built. The Caldwell residence might be silent, but Eleanor's mind was screaming. The game, whatever it was, had changed. And she was finally ready to play. The first step was a quiet betrayal of her own. The following week, while Marcus was in the shower, his baritone voice a tuneless rumble, Eleanor slipped into his home office. It felt sordid, this clandestine search through the life of the man she had promised to love and honor. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the drawer of his mahogany desk, the one where he kept his personal receipts and statements. She wasn't a snooping wife, she was a CEO conducting due diligence on a failing investment. That was the narrative she clung to. There it was, tucked beneath a stack of innocuous receipts for coffee and dry cleaning. The Amex Black Card statement, Her name was primary on the account, of course. She scanned the lines, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. There were the usual charges: lunches with clients, gasoline for his Jaguar, a new set of golf clubs. And then she saw it. A recurring charge, twice a week for the past 4 months, from a restaurant called La Vigne. It wasn't a place she knew. It sounded intimate, romantic. The charges were always for two. A little deeper in the drawer, wedged into the back, was a small glossy black bag from a lingerie boutique called Fleur de Mal. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a receipt. A lace bralette and matching thong. Size small. Eleanor was a medium. The cold knot in her stomach tightened into a block of ice. It was one thing to suspect, to feel the cold draft of neglect. It was another entirely to hold the crisp, tangible proof of it in her hand. She closed the drawer, her movements precise, silent. She returned to the master bedroom just as Marcus emerged from the bathroom, a towel slung low on his hips, steam billowing around him. He smiled at her, a practiced, easy smile that no longer reached his eyes. "Morning, darling," he said, kissing her cheek. His skin was warm and smelled of expensive soap. "Big day today, might be a late one." "Of course," she replied, her voice even, a marvel of control. "Don't work too hard." She needed help. This was beyond her scope. Confronting him with a credit card statement would only result in more lies, gaslighting, accusations of her being paranoid. He was a lawyer. He could argue his way out of anything. She needed irrefutable proof. She needed a professional. That afternoon she called Clara, her friend since their days at Vassar. Clara was a divorce attorney herself, a sharp, cynical woman who had seen the absolute worst of human nature and had come out the other side with a biting sense of humor and an unwavering loyalty to those she loved. They met at a quiet cafe in the West Village. Eleanor laid it all out: the late nights, the secret phone, the restaurant, the lingerie. Clara listened patiently, her expression hardening with each detail. "The classic pathetic playbook," Clara said, stirring her espresso with unnecessary vigor. "Honestly, Ellie, I'm surprised it took him this long to get sloppy. Most of these idiots are leaving a trail of breadcrumbs a blind man could follow within 6 months." "I feel so stupid, Clara." "Don't," Clara snapped, her voice firm. "Stupid is ignoring it. You're not ignoring it. You're handling it. So what's the plan? Do you want to burn his collection of first editions or just cut the crotch out of all his Xenia suits?" A weak smile touched Eleanor's lips. "I need to know who she is. I need to see it for myself. I need something he can't possibly deny." Clara nodded, her demeanor shifting from friend to professional. "You need a PI, not one of these flashy television types. You need a ghost. I know a man. Arthur Davies, ex-MI6. The man can blend into wallpaper. He's expensive, but he's the best. He'll get you photos, an address, a name, her blood type, and what she had for breakfast. You want his number?" Eleanor took a deep breath. This was the point of no return. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Yes, I do." Hiring Mr. Davies was like commissioning a portrait from an old master. It was a quiet, discreet, and incredibly expensive affair. They met in a sterile, anonymous office suite he kept for such consultations. He was a small, neat man in his late 60s with pale, observant eyes and an aura of complete unflappability. He didn't offer condolences or judgments. He simply listened, took notes in a small leather-bound book, and asked precise, clarifying questions. "You will receive a secure digital file every Friday," he stated, his voice a soft, cultured murmur. "It will contain a full report of Mr. Caldwell's movements outside of his professional obligations, complete with time-stamped photographs and any pertinent new information. My fee is outlined in the contract. I require a 50% retainer to begin." Eleanor transferred the money without a second thought. It was a pittance compared to what she stood to lose. Or perhaps what she stood to gain. The truth. The first report arrived exactly 1 week later. The email was encrypted, the instructions for accessing it clear and simple. Eleanor opened the file with a hand that felt strangely steady. The ice in her gut had frozen her solid, numbing the pain, leaving only a cold, sharp purpose. The report was meticulous. It detailed Marcus's week, 2 late nights at the office that were actually dinners at La Vigne. And there were the pictures, grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. Marcus, sitting at a candle-lit table, laughing. Leaning across the table, his hand covering the much younger, manicured hand of a woman. Her face was turned away in most of the shots, but one captured her profile. She was beautiful, of course. Young, with a cascade of dark, glossy hair and a vibrant, unlined face. The second report, a week later, was the one that changed everything. It contained a name, Isabella Rossi. Age, 26. Occupation, aspiring actress, which seemed to be code for part-time model and full-time social media influencer. And it contained an address. Mr. Davies had followed them from the restaurant to a sleek, modern condominium building in the newly developed Hudson Yards. The Azure, it was called. Apartment 14B. Eleanor stared at the address on her screen. The Azure. A wave of dizziness washed over her, so potent she had to grip the edge of her desk. It wasn't just a name, it wasn't just a building. It was a number in a very long spreadsheet. It was a line item in a quarterly report. It was one of the flagship properties in the portfolio of E. Vance Holdings. Her private real estate investment firm, the one she'd built from the ground up using her inheritance. She owned the Azure. She owned the building. She owned the apartment. The realization hit her not like a lightning bolt, but like the slow, inexorable creep of a glacier, the sheer, staggering arrogance of it. Marcus hadn't just found a mistress, he had installed her in an apartment paid for with money he received from a salary that was, in essence, funded by his wife, inside a building owned by his wife. He was a parasite, living fat and happy within the host, utterly oblivious. The ice in Eleanor's veins didn't melt. It hardened into something else entirely. It hardened into steel. The pain was still there, a deep, resonant hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed now by a cold, righteous fury. This wasn't just an affair. This was a profound, multifaceted betrayal that touched every corner of her life. He hadn't just cheated on her, he had used her, mocked her, and underestimated her on a scale that was almost biblical in its scope. She closed the laptop. The plan that began to form in her mind was no longer about simply exposing him. That was too simple, too clean. He didn't deserve a quick, honest confrontation. He deserved a spectacle. He deserved to be dismantled piece by piece in the most public and humiliating way possible. And she, the quiet, supportive wife, the woman he saw as a comfortable fixture in his life, was going to be the architect of his ruin. She pulled up the tenant file for apartment 14B at the Azure. The lease was under Isabella Rossi's name, but the rent was paid automatically each month from a trust account Marcus had set up years ago with her money. An account she'd forgotten even existed. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. He was using her past generosity to fund his present betrayal. Eleanor spent the next 2 weeks in a state of suspended animation, moving through her life with a placid, almost serene exterior that belied the furious machinations of her mind. She was polite to Marcus, inquiring about his day, ensuring his shirts were pressed. She played the part of the dutiful wife so perfectly that he seemed to relax in her presence, the guilt he must have felt assuaged by her apparent obliviousness. He mistook her control for complacency. It was a fatal error. She had Mr. Davies continue his surveillance not because she needed more proof of the affair, but because she needed to understand its rhythm. She learned that Tuesday and Thursday nights were their nights. They always started at Lavigne around 8, and from there they would go back to her apartment at the Azure. It was a predictable, comfortable routine. The kind of routine that breeds carelessness. The plan required precision. It required the perfect stage, the perfect audience, and the perfect timing. Eleanor began to prepare. She booked an appointment with her stylist for a cut and color. She purchased a new dress, not a soft romantic gown like the one she'd worn on her anniversary, but a sharp, tailored sheath dress of blood-red silk by Tom Ford. It was a warrior's dress. She paired it with lethally high black Christian Louboutin stilettos. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the wounded wife. She saw a woman on the verge of reclaiming her power. She made a call to her asset manager at E. Vance Holdings. "Michael," she said, her voice cool and professional, "I'd like to schedule a building inspection for this Thursday evening. The Azure. Let's say around 10 p.m. I want to do a walkthrough of the common areas and one of the Beeline apartments on an upper floor." Let's make it 14B. Please inform the tenant that the owner will be conducting a brief, formal inspection. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Of course, Ms. Vance, Michael said, using her professional maiden name. A bit unusual for you to do a personal inspection at that hour, but I'll make the arrangements. The tenant will be notified in writing as per the lease agreement. Excellent, Eleanor said and hung up. The first domino had been pushed. Isabella Rossi would receive a formal, legally binding notice that the owner of her apartment would be arriving at 10 p.m. on Thursday. She would, Eleanor gambled, immediately call Marcus in a panic. And Marcus, arrogant and dismissive, would tell her not to worry. He would assume it was just some faceless management company drone. He would never, in a million years, connect the owner to his quiet, unassuming wife. On Thursday evening, Eleanor sat before her vanity, applying her makeup with the steady hand of a surgeon. She chose a bold red lipstick to match her dress. Each stroke was deliberate, a ritual of armoring herself for the battle to come. Marcus had called an hour earlier. "Going to be another late one, darling," he'd said, his voice slick with the practiced ease of his deception. "This deposition is dragging on forever." "No problem at all," she'd replied, her voice a sweet melody of understanding. "You work so hard. I'll just have a quiet night in." At 7:30 she left the house. She didn't take her own Bentley, she took an Uber, a discreet black sedan that slipped through the city traffic unnoticed. She had it drop her 2 blocks from Lavinia. She walked the rest of the way, the crisp autumn air feeling electric against her skin. The click of her heels on the pavement was a drumbeat, counting down the final moments of her old life. She had made a reservation under her maiden name, Vance. The maitre d' led her to a small, secluded table in the corner, one she had specifically requested. It was perfect. It offered a clear, unobstructed view of the restaurant's entrance and the cozy, candle-lit tables in the center, but was itself shrouded in a delicate play of shadows. She ordered a glass of Sancerre and waited. At 8:15 they arrived. Marcus was laughing, his arm draped possessively around Isabella's shoulders. She was breathtaking, Eleanor had to admit, in a youthful, obvious way. She wore a tight white dress that showcased a body honed by countless hours at the gym. They were a cliché, a walking embodiment of a midlife crisis. The hostess led them to a prime table right in the center of the room. The stage was set. Eleanor watched them, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. She observed them as a scientist might observe specimens under a microscope. She saw the way he touched the small of her back, the way Isabella looked at him with wide, adoring eyes. She saw him order the expensive wine, the one he knew Eleanor loved but always called an unnecessary extravagance when they were out together. The pain was a dull, distant ache now, a phantom limb. In its place was a vast, cold calm. She let them get comfortable. She watched them finish their appetizers and order their main courses. A young waitress, her name tag read Chloe, came to her table. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" the waitress asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "You haven't touched your wine." "Everything is perfect," Eleanor said, giving the girl a serene smile. "I'm just waiting for the right moment." The girl looked confused, but nodded and walked away. The right moment came just as their entrees arrived. Eleanor stood up, her movements fluid and graceful. She picked up her wine glass and began to walk towards their table. The red of her dress was a slash of color in the muted, elegant restaurant. Heads turned, a hush began to fall over the nearby tables as people sensed the impending drama. Marcus saw her first. His fork, laden with seared scallops, froze halfway to his mouth. His face went through a rapid, ugly series of transformations. From blissful ignorance to utter shock, then to disbelief, and finally settling on a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Isabella followed his gaze, her perfectly made-up face contorting in confusion and alarm. Eleanor stopped at their table. She didn't say a word. She simply stood there, looking at Marcus, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was Marcus who broke it, his voice a low, vicious hiss. "What in the hell are you doing here, Eleanor?" The question hung in the air, vibrating with malice. Diners at adjacent tables fell silent, their forks poised over their plates, their conversations dying in their throats. They were no longer patrons. They were an audience, and the curtain had just gone up on the evening's main event. Eleanor allowed a small, enigmatic smile to touch her lips. She didn't look at Isabella, refusing to acknowledge her as anything more than a prop in this scene. Her entire focus was on her husband, the man whose face was now a mottled canvas of rage and panic. "What are you doing?" he repeated, his voice rising in volume, a desperate attempt to seize control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. "Are you following me? Is that what this is?" "My God, Eleanor, have you lost your mind? I told you I was in a deposition." He was trying to paint her as the hysterical, obsessed wife. It was a classic tactic, one she had anticipated. She let him talk, let him dig his own grave with every word. "This is pathetic," he spat, gesturing around the restaurant, which was now watching them with undisguised fascination. He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial snarl, though it was still loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're embarrassing me. Go home. Now, we will talk about your little paranoid fantasy later." Isabella, who had been frozen in her chair, finally found her voice. "Marcus, who is this?" she asked, her voice a trembling whisper. Marcus shot her a look that was meant to be silencing, but Eleanor answered for him. "I'm his wife," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the quiet room. A collective soft gasp rippled through the audience. "Get out, Eleanor," Marcus seethed, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "You have no right to be here. You have no right to follow me and create a scene. I need space. You're suffocating me. Is that what you want? To chain me to the house so you can keep an eye on me every second of the day?" His performance was impressive in its audacity. He was the victim, the beleaguered husband hounded by his possessive, unstable wife. He was playing to the crowd, trying to win their sympathy. Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of her Sancerre, her eyes never leaving his. The wine was crisp and cold, a perfect counterpoint to the fire building inside her. She set the glass down with a soft click. "Follow you?" she asked, her voice laced with a faint, almost pitying amusement. "Oh, Marcus, you have such a high opinion of yourself. I assure you my evening plans had absolutely nothing to do with you." "Liar," he hissed. "There's no other reason for you to be here. This isn't your kind of place." "You're right," she agreed smoothly. "It isn't. But my business, unfortunately, brought me to this part of town tonight. I was simply having a quiet drink before an appointment." He scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound. "An appointment? At 9 o'clock at night? Don't insult my intelligence, Eleanor. What kind of appointment?" This was it. The moment she had been waiting for, the culmination of weeks of pain, planning, and ice-cold rage. She let the silence hang for a beat longer, drawing every eye in the room to her. She leaned in slightly, as if sharing a secret, though her voice remained perfectly audible. "I have an inspection," she said. Marcus stared at her, his brows furrowed in confusion. "An inspection? What are you talking about?" "A property inspection," she clarified, her voice as soft as silk and as sharp as glass. "At one of my buildings, just a few blocks from here, a lovely new development. You may have heard of it. It's called the Azure." The name hit him like a physical blow. She saw it in the sudden slackening of his jaw, the flicker of pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes. He understood. Not everything, not yet, but he understood that this was no coincidence. Isabella, however, looked from Marcus to Eleanor, her expression a mask of bewilderment. "I don't understand," Isabella murmured. "What does that have to do with anything?" Eleanor finally turned her gaze to the younger woman. It was not a look of anger or jealousy. It was the look a queen might give to a scullery maid who had spoken out of turn, a look of utter dismissal. "My appointment," Eleanor continued, her eyes locking back onto Marcus's, "is a standard owner's walkthrough. It's scheduled for 10 p.m. I believe the tenant was notified. Apartment 14B. The color drained from Marcus's face. He looked ashen, his skin stretched taut over his bones. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The arrogant, furious husband was gone, replaced by a cornered, terrified animal. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Isabella, however, gasped. "Apartment 14B. That's my apartment. I got a notice about an owner's inspection tonight. Marcus, you said it was just the building management. You said not to worry about it." Her voice was high and panicked, the accusation clear. The pieces were clicking into place for her, forming a picture she did not want to see. Marcus finally managed to speak, his voice a strangled croak. "Eleanor, what are you saying?" Eleanor stood up to her full height, a magnificent avenging angel in her blood-red dress. She looked down at her husband, at the man who had underestimated her so profoundly, who had mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness. "I'm not saying anything, Marcus," she said, her voice ringing with a final devastating clarity. "I'm telling you, I wasn't following you tonight. I was on my way to inspect my property. You see, I own the Azure. I own your little love nest. I own apartment 14B. She paused, letting the words sink in, letting the full weight of their meaning crush him. "So while you've been spending my money to pay the rent on my apartment for your mistress," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout, "I've been the one signing the checks for the building's maintenance. I hope the amenities are to your satisfaction." The silence in the restaurant was absolute. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Isabella looked like she was going to be sick, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror and dawning comprehension. Her sugar daddy wasn't a king, he was a jester, living in his wife's castle. And Marcus simply stared at her, his carefully constructed world, his double life, his ego, all of it had been annihilated in the space of 30 seconds. The intricate web of lies he had spun had been set ablaze by a single inescapable truth. He tried to stand, perhaps to argue, perhaps to flee, but his body betrayed him. His legs seemed to give way. He made a strange guttural sound, a gasp for air that wasn't there, and then he collapsed. He didn't fall to the floor, but rather slumped forward, his head hitting the table with a dull, sickening thud, amidst the scattered remains of his last illicit supper. He was a puppet whose strings had just been cut. The collapse of Marcus Caldwell was not a dramatic, flailing event. It was a quiet, heavy slump, a surrender of bone and muscle. He lay with his cheek pressed against a half-eaten piece of sea bass, his eyes wide and vacant, staring at nothing. The sound of his head hitting the polished wood of the table was the only sound in the cavernous, silent restaurant. For a moment, everyone was frozen. Then chaos erupted in carefully controlled, high-society ripples. The maître d' rushed forward, his face a mask of professional panic. Isabella Rossi simply sat there, paralyzed, looking from Marcus's still form to Eleanor's composed one, her mind clearly struggling to process the cataclysmic implosion of her world. Eleanor, however, remained perfectly still. She looked down at the wreckage of her husband, not with triumph, not with pity, but with a profound and chilling emptiness. This broken man, this pathetic shell, was the cause of so much pain. Seeing him like this brought her no joy, only a grim, hollow sense of finality. "Someone should probably call an ambulance," she said to the maître d', her voice as steady as if she were commenting on the weather. She then placed a crisp $100 bill on her own table, turned without a backward glance, and walked out of the restaurant. The click of her Louboutins on the marble floor was sharp and decisive, a punctuation mark at the end of a very long sentence. She walked with the unhurried grace of a woman who had just won a war. The final act took place 3 weeks later, not in a courtroom, but in the sterile glass-walled conference room of Marcus's own law firm, a room that smelled of lemon polish and quiet desperation. He sat opposite Eleanor and Clara, a shrunken, haggard version of his former self. His expensive Xenia suit, once a symbol of his power, now hung on his frame like a shroud. A nerve twitched violently beside his eye. His lawyer, a portly, sweating man named Henderson, shuffled papers with an air of profound discomfort. "My client feels the terms of this settlement are punitive," Henderson began, his voice lacking conviction. "Mr. Caldwell contributed 15 years of his life to this marriage. He feels he is entitled to a more equitable division of assets." Clara let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed in the tense room. "Equitable? Mr. Henderson, the only asset your client brought into this marriage was a suitcase of ambition, which, I might add, my client paid to fill. Everything, the house, the cars, his partnership buy-in, was funded by Eleanor. The terms on the table are not punitive, they are profoundly, almost foolishly generous." He gets to keep his teeth and his last name. I'd call that a win." Marcus's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his voice a raw whisper. "This isn't about money, Eleanor. This is about you trying to destroy me for one mistake. You humiliated me in front of everyone. Isn't that enough?" Eleanor, who had been silent, her posture immaculate, finally met his gaze. Her eyes were like chips of ice. "One mistake? Marcus, your life for the past year has been one long calculated deception built on a foundation of my trust and my capital. This isn't about humiliation. This is about accountability. You signed a prenuptial agreement, one you yourself drafted, I might add. You called it ironclad. You boasted to my father that it was the most brilliant legal document you'd ever written. These are simply the consequences of you violating its most basic clauses." "I'll fight it," he snarled, a flicker of his old courtroom arrogance returning, though it was brittle now, transparent. "I'll drag this through the courts for years. I'll make sure every detail of our lives is plastered across the post. I'll paint you as a vindictive, controlling shrew. You want a war, Eleanor? You'll get one. Let's see how your precious Evance Holdings holds up under that kind of scrutiny." Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply reached into her leather portfolio and slid a slim navy blue folder across the polished mahogany table. It bore a single, elegant monogram in silver, EV. It stopped directly in front of Marcus. "What's this?" he asked, his bravado faltering, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. "More pictures of me and Isabella. I'll own it. I was weak. It won't be enough to ruin me." "Oh, this has nothing to do with Isabella," Eleanor said softly, a chilling gentleness in her tone. "She was merely a symptom of a much deeper disease. Your greed. You see, when I hired Mr. Davies, I was quite thorough. I didn't just ask him to look into your evenings. I asked him to look into your days as well. I'd started to notice certain coincidences. Deals my firm was pursuing would suddenly face unexpected competition. Private acquisition targets would suddenly become public knowledge." Marcus's hand, reaching for the folder, froze mid-air. The twitch in his eye became a frantic, uncontrollable flutter. He looked like a man staring down the barrel of a gun. "Open it, Marcus," Eleanor urged, her voice dangerously calm. With a trembling hand, he opened the folder. Inside were not photographs. The first page was a transcript, a conversation between him and another man, time-stamped, every word captured in stark black and white. "The Vance bid for the waterfront property is capped at $95 million. His own voice read on the page. "Come in at 96, and it's yours. My fee remains the same." Behind the transcript were copies of encrypted emails, offshore wire transfers to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands, and phone logs. They detailed a pattern of behavior far more damning than infidelity. Marcus had been systematically using the privileged confidential information he gleaned from being married to the CEO of Evance Holdings to tip off rival firms, clients of his own, for a substantial consulting fee. It was insider trading. It was a gross violation of marital privilege and professional ethics. It was a federal crime. "Mr. Davies is ex-MI6, you know," Eleanor continued, her voice a placid murmur in the dead-silent room. "He is exceptionally good at finding things people don't want found. But the funny thing is, he didn't even have to look that hard for this. One of the brokers you tipped off, a man named Jonathan Finch, happened to be a protégé of my father's. You probably don't remember him. You once dismissed him at a charity gala as a nobody from Queens. People remember things like that, Marcus. He has a rather old-fashioned sense of loyalty. He came to me months ago, sickened by what you were asking him to do. He wore a wire. The last bit of air seemed to leave Marcus's lungs. He stared at the papers, his face turning the color of ash. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped onto the damning evidence. He looked from the folder to Eleanor, his eyes wide with a new, more profound terror than he had shown in the restaurant. This wasn't just the end of his marriage, it was the end of his career, his reputation, his freedom. It was the end of everything. "You have two options," Eleanor stated, laying out the terms of his surrender with the precision of a surgeon. "Option 1, you sign the divorce settlement as it is written right now. You walk away with the small, non-revocable trust my father set up for you as a wedding gift. A final irony for you to contemplate. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement so airtight you won't be able to say my name to a bartender. In return, this folder, she tapped the blue folder with a perfectly manicured nail, and Mr. Finch's recordings are sealed in my private vault forever. You get to disappear. She paused, letting the weight of his potential salvation settle. Then she delivered the alternative. Option 2, you refuse. You say one more word about fighting me, and a digital copy of this folder will be delivered to the senior partners of this firm, the New York State Bar Association, and the Securities and Exchange Commission before you can get to the elevator. You won't be selling timeshares, Marcus. You'll be trading cigarettes for protection in a federal prison. The choice is yours. Henderson, his face pale and slick with sweat, looked at his client. Marcus, he began, his voice a choked plea, for God's sake, sign the papers. Marcus Caldwell did not speak. He simply reached for the pen Clara held out to him. His hand shook so violently he could barely grip it, the expensive Mont Blanc feeling like a lead weight. The scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound. It was a spidery, broken signature, a frantic scrawl that bore no resemblance to his once confident flourish. He had been utterly, completely, and irrevocably checkmated. As he pushed the papers back across the table, his gaze lifted to Eleanor one last time, a desperate, pleading look. He saw nothing there for him. No anger, no sadness, not even the satisfaction of victory. He saw only the cool, dispassionate appraisal of a CEO closing a failed account. Eleanor calmly reached out, her fingers closing over the navy blue folder. She slid it back into her portfolio with a soft, final click. I believe our business is concluded, Mr. Henderson, she said, standing. Clara rose with her. And Marcus, Clara added, pausing at the door, unable to resist a final twist of the knife. A word of advice. Florida is lovely this time of year. Very popular with men who need to reinvent themselves, and it has no state income tax. You'll want to think about things like that now. The aftermath was no longer messy. It was surgical. Marcus vanished from New York society. Stripped of his job, his home, and his reputation, he became a ghost. Isabella Rossi, after a brief and unsuccessful attempt to sell her story to the tabloids, was served an eviction notice and a cease and desist letter from Clara's office and disappeared back into the anonymity from which she came. A week after the signing, Eleanor and Clara sat in the newly empty living room of the Caldwell residence, surrounded by packed boxes. They sipped champagne from crystal flutes. You know, Clara said, swirling the golden liquid, for a while there I was worried. I thought you might just let him get away with it. Do you feel anything, Ellie? A single shred of pity for the man he was. The old Ellie is gone, Eleanor replied, her voice quiet but firm. She died on our 15th anniversary, the woman who was born that night. She doesn't tolerate parasites. Pity is for victims, Clara. He was a predator. You don't pity a shark when you pull it from your own waters. She took a sip of her champagne. He never saw me as a partner. He saw me as a resource, a well-funded, beautifully decorated bank vault he happened to live in. His mistake was thinking the vault was empty. 2 days later, in a quiet, wood-paneled bar in the financial district, Eleanor met with Jonathan Finch. He was a man in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake, the antithesis of Marcus's slick charm. I can't thank you enough, Jonathan, Eleanor said, sliding a thick envelope across the small table. This is for your trouble, and your courage. Finch pushed the envelope back toward her. Absolutely not, Ms. Vance. My first job on the street, your father took a chance on me. He co-signed the lease for my first real office. He told me, a man's word and his loyalty are the only currencies that matter. Marcus Caldwell has neither. At your father's memorial, I overheard him on the phone, calling your father old money with old ideas, and boasting that the future belonged to men like him, men who weren't afraid to bend the rules. He took a sip of his bourbon. He was wrong. The future belongs to people who honor their debts. Consider my debt to your father paid. It was my privilege to help you protect his legacy. Eleanor flourished in the light. She sold the cavernous house, a beautiful cage of memories, and moved into a stunning penthouse overlooking Central Park. She took the helm of E. Vance Holdings not as a quiet power, but as a celebrated visionary leader. The whispers that followed her now were not of scandal, but of admiration and a little bit of healthy fear. She became known for her ruthless due diligence and her uncanny ability to spot a bad investment, in business and in life. The final pathetic chapter of Marcus Caldwell's story came not from a PI, but from a junior analyst at her firm. The young woman sent a hesitant email to Eleanor's personal account with the subject line, "You won't believe this." Attached was a photo taken with a phone camera. It showed a sun-blasted strip mall in Naples, Florida. In front of a garish storefront that read Paradise Found Timeshare Opportunities stood Marcus. He was wearing a cheap sweat-stained polyester suit, his face puffy, his smile a desperate predatory rictus as he tried to lure a retired couple inside. He was no longer a shark in the deep waters of Manhattan finance. He was a bottom feeder in a stagnant pond. Eleanor looked at the photo, at the ghost of the man she had once loved, and felt nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved. She deleted the email. One crisp autumn evening, a year to the day of the confrontation at La Vigne, Eleanor stood on the terrace of her new home. She was holding the latest issue of Forbes. On the cover was a photograph of her, poised and powerful, against the backdrop of the New York skyline. The headline read, "Eleanor Vance, the architect of an empire." In the distance, the lights of the Azure twinkled, no longer a monument to betrayal, but a glowing testament to her ownership. The silence that surrounded her now was not the heavy, oppressive silence of a dying marriage, nor the curated silence of wealth. It was a sovereign silence, the sound of peace, of power, of a life that was wholly and completely her own. She had faced the ultimate betrayal, not by shattering, but by gathering her strength, her intelligence, and her resources, and meticulously, brilliantly, liquidating a bad asset. She had not just survived, she was the architect of her own world, and she was finally building it on a foundation of solid rock.